My name is John Barr, and I'm a History and Humanities professor here at Lone Star College-Kingwood. And we'd like to welcome you to our final talk this semester in our Curious Minds series. And that you can see one of the guiding principles of our series right there in a quote from Samuel Johnson. And then another important principle is that talking about books and ideas is as important educationally as are the books and subjects themselves. And our author today is Carden, who is co-author of this book, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, which I hope I'm being fair in saying it's a distillation of a 3-volume economic history of the development of a new way of thinking about making money in the 16th and 17th centuries. Okay, so I thought I would read, and I read this last week, but not everybody was here last week. I thought I would read a quote from Greta Thunberg's book, The Climate Book, from her, where she writes on page 19, the Industrial Revolution, which was fueled by slavery and colonization, brought unimaginable wealth to the global north, and in particular to a small minority of people living there. Our speaker today, Art Carden, is going to challenge that viewpoint that slavery was the cause of the New World's wealth or the Old World's wealth. And it's going to be an interesting talk, I believe. Okay, so this is in part related to, I think it's fair to say, a thesis of the historian Eric Williams, who I think it was in 1944, if I'm not mistaken, in his book Capitalism and Slavery, he had argued that it was capitalism and slavery, of course, that had helped fuel the wealth of the old world and the Industrial Revolution. And again, our speaker today, our author, Art Carden, will challenge that viewpoint in his book, again, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. So, Steve, okay, so the procedure for today is pretty simple. We're going to introduce Art, which I'm doing now. He'll speak for 30, 35, maybe 40 minutes. We'll take some Q&A, think about questions that you got during the talk, okay? And we will take Q&A from you, but mainly enjoy the talk. And it is important after it's all over to ask the questions that you've got. We ask that you stay the entire time. We should be done by 1:20 or so. If for some reason you had to leave because of an emergency, please leave through the back of the room. But finally, just real quickly from the book, Art Carden is a professor of economics at the Brock School of Business at Samford University in Alabama, and he's a frequent contributor to Forbes.com, among other popular magazines and scholarly journals. And let's give Art a nice warm Lone Star welcome. And Steve, the PowerPoint.
All right, thank you so much for having me. First, any invitation that says, hey, would you like to come and talk about economics is pretty attractive. Second, my sister, her husband, and their 5 daughters live in Houston. So, hey, would you like to come and talk about economics and also hang out with your family is also a very, very, very attractive proposition. And yeah, so Deirdre McCloskey and I wrote a book. It's called Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, How the Bourgeois Deal Enriched the World. And very quickly, I want to kind of say a word or two about where we're going over about the next half an hour. First, we'll say a thing or two about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which people who are about my age might remember. Second, we'll talk about what doesn't explain the difference between then and now. Spoiler alert, it's not slavery, it's not imperialism, it's not colonialism. We'll talk about what does explain the difference between then and now. And we'll talk about what we do about it. What do we do going forward, armed with this new knowledge about what explains the difference between the world that our ancestors inhabited and the world that we inhabit today. But first, I want to go to a magical time called the late 1980s and early 1990s. A young Keanu Reeves is star of a movie called Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where he plays Ted Theodore Logan, who, along with his buddy Bill, played by Alex Preston, are a pair of slackers in San Dimas, California. They're going to start a band called Wild Stallions that is going to produce music that will create some sort of utopian future. Now, it turns out that this future is in danger because Bill and Ted are about to fail their history presentation. A guy named Rufus hops in a magic phone booth, goes back to San Dimas, California in the late 1980s, and helps Bill and Ted with their presentation about what great historical figures might think about life in San Dimas, California in the year 1988. They go through this, they take this magic phone booth, through history. They pick up Billy the Kid, Abraham Lincoln, Joan of Arc, Ludwig van Beethoven, Sigmund Freud, Genghis Khan, maybe one or two others. Then they bring them back for their presentation about what they would think about life in San Dimas, California in the year 1988. And they pass, and history is saved. Raises a question about one of the people that they bring back, Joan of Arc, who lived in the 15th century in France. And I want to imagine a similar exercise today. If Bill and Ted were around today and they had to show Joan of Arc how life in the year 2023 differs from life in the 15th century in France, where should Bill and Ted take her? Or, I'll ask you guys, if Joan of Arc showed up and asked you to show her one place or one thing that illustrates most of all how different life in Houston, Texas in 2023 is from life in 15th century France, where would you take Joan of Arc? Okay. So I'm asking you guys, where would you take Joan of Arc to show her the differences between, or the biggest differences, the most important differences between life in 2023 Houston and life in 15th century France?
Medical center.
Okay, medical center. A medical center, the very idea of medicine is pretty revolutionary. And indeed, we're only about 100, 150 years removed from a period of time in which going to the doctor was actually more dangerous than not going to the doctor. So the very notion of modern medicine is itself pretty revolutionary. Where else? What are some other places you might want to take Joan of Arc?
Astros game.
An Astros game. And an Astros game. Okay, because first of all, the Astros are very good. Second, because it's a way of people entertaining one another in something that is basically vicarious combat, but that doesn't actually involve spilling any blood. Okay. That's pretty cool. Okay. That's pretty cool. NASA. Okay. NASA would also be important. The very notion that we can go to the moon or that we can go to outer space. Okay, these are things that would absolutely blow Joan of Arc's mind. Where else? Let's hear from some students. Where would you take Joan of Arc? Yep.
Probably Whataburger.
Probably Whataburger. Ah, yes. Okay. Whataburger. Okay. Okay. And this is a really good answer for a couple of reasons. In fact, I'm planning to go to Whataburger after my talk. So, yeah. So Whataburger, because one, the food is delicious. Two, the food is cheap. So she would be able to get at Whataburger for a trivial sum, probably more calories, more net nutrition than a lot of people will be able to get in a week. There's a tweet that I saw one time illustrating kind of exactly this point. It says, you might take it for granted, but someone today in the early 21st century opening a bag of Doritos can enjoy more extreme nacho flavor in the course of a single 15 or 20 minutes than one of our ancestors could have in an entire lifetime. I think that says something too about where we might want to take Joan of Arc. Where else might we take Joan of Arc to show her the biggest differences? Yes, sir.
Costco.
Costco. Okay. Costco is another very, very good answer. Costco is another very good answer. And in fact, it is right around where I would personally take Joan of Arc. Okay. I would take Joan of Arc to Walmart. Okay. I'll take Joan of Arc to Walmart, or failing that, Target, or failing that, Costco. Why Walmart? Why would someone want to take Joan of Arc to Walmart to show her the differences between life in 15th century France and life in early 21st century Texas? And this occurred to me once while I was walking around in the Walmart nearest to where we live in Birmingham, and I was just kind of taking it in and thinking about just the sheer majesty, and I use that word deliberately, of a Walmart supercenter, which is stacked floor to ceiling, a couple of 100,000 square feet of goods that would have each of which individually probably would have blown Joan of Arc's mind. Food, clothing, consumer electronics, aspirin, hair care products, the whole giant list of things that you can buy at Walmart that would not have been available to Joan of Arc. But there's something else. There's something else about shopping at Walmart that I think really illustrates the big difference. And that is Walmart's clientele. That's Walmart's clientele. Who shops at Walmart? Peasants, yes. Yeah, the modern day analog to peasants. Okay, in fact, so you mentioned Costco. So if you look at the average household income of Costco members, it's substantially higher than the average household income of typical Walmart shoppers. There's an entire website called peopleofwalmart.com that you should not look up, which of course means that everyone in the room with a laptop out right now is probably about to look it up, that is dedicated entirely to making fun of the kind of people, quote unquote, who shop at Walmart. But when you go to Walmart, you're not surrounded by the powdered lords, you're not surrounded by the elites, you're not surrounded by upper-level party officials. You're not surrounded by royalty. You're surrounded by the sometimes quite literally unwashed masses. What makes Walmart so remarkable, and why I think Walmart is the correct answer to this question, is the fact that Walmart makes available to people like us, average, everyday people, the descendants of peasants, the descendants of slaves, the descendants of the oppressed, the descendants of people that they don't write history books about. My great-uncle Cleet the bootlegger from Lauderdale County, Alabama, is probably not going to show up on your history syllabus anytime soon. But it makes available to all of us an untold cornucopia of goods, or an unprecedented cornucopia of goods at borderline trivial prices. If you can't get it at Walmart, you probably don't need it. In fact, if you can get it at Walmart, you probably still don't need it. But Walmart has incredible quantities of very low-priced goods for common people. And that, I think, is the biggest difference between life then, in 15th century France, and life now. Okay. It's been said, in fact, some research shows, that one of the biggest health problems facing people with low incomes in the United States is obesity. Think about that for half a second. Obesity. The problem facing people with very low incomes in countries like the United States and Canada is not that they're starving to death. It's that they have too many delicious calories, too many Whataburgers, presumably, okay, and not enough of other things. That's remarkable. The way that the journalist Jonah Goldberg put it in describing this difference between life for almost all of history and life today is as follows. He wrote, and I quote, "The natural state of mankind is grinding poverty, punctuated by horrific violence, terminating with an early death. It was this way for a very, very long time." If you've encountered the philosopher and thinker Thomas Hobbes, you might have read where Thomas Hobbes wrote that in The State of Nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And indeed, it was. The economic historian Douglas North puts it this way: economic history is a depressing tale of miscalculation leading to famine, starvation, defeat and warfare, economic stagnation and decline, and indeed the disappearance of entire civilizations. Life, again, for almost all of history, for almost everybody, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But things are different now. Things are different now. First things first, there are a lot more of us. First things first, there are a lot more of us. Okay. We went from a world that was pretty much completely empty to a world that's still almost totally empty. But now there are over 8 billion people in the world. There are over 8 billion people in the world living at standards that Joan of Arc could not have imagined. Okay. Moreover, and importantly, as we'll talk about a little bit later, each new person who comes into the world brings a very, very, very important asset. And that very important asset is a brain. And that brain is something with which they can have new ideas. They can invent new stuff. They can come up with new processes. They can find new ways to get more out of the resources at our disposal. So there are a lot more of us. A lot more of us. Which means, therefore, that we must be much poorer, right? Wrong. We must be sort of all starving to death because we're fighting each other for resources. Again, wrong. Why? Life expectancy today is much, much, much higher in most countries than it has pretty much ever been. Life expectancy is really, really high. At the height of the Roman Empire, life expectancy was maybe in the 20s. Life expectancy in 15th century France, probably somewhere in the 30s. Life expectancy in England and France at the beginning of the 19th century, about 40 or so. Things that are driving this: 1, very high infant mortality. 2, very high child mortality. Today, life expectancy in countries like the United States is in the 80s. Well, pushing 80. In some countries, it's 80 and above. In countries like Nigeria, one of the lower income countries in the world, life expectancy is about 60 or so. So you can expect a baby born in Nigeria, one of the poorest places on earth today, can expect to live half again as long as someone born in one of the richest parts of the world a couple of centuries ago. You can actually look up at the Social Security Administration estimates of your remaining life expectancy. And so for my students, most of whom are sophomores at Samford University, who are about 19 years old, they can expect to live, the guys can expect to live about another 62 or 63 years. The girls can expect to live about another 65 or 66 years. Okay. So people have, at the age of 19, more life remaining than someone who was born in one of the richest countries on earth a couple hundred years ago. There are a lot more of us. We live a lot longer. We enjoy much higher incomes. GDP per capita, okay, and gross domestic product, if you've taken an economics class, is our measure of the value of this stuff, the goods and services that get produced in a country in a year. For most of history, people lived on an average of, in roughly modern prices, $4 or $5 a day. $4 or $5 a day. They had to pay their rent. If they were renting anything, they had to pay for the groceries, clothing, all of it on about $4 or $5 a day. My guess is there are people in the room who've spent more than $5 on coffee today. Today, people live on 10 times that around the world. Okay. The average person on Earth lives on anywhere from 5 to 10 times what our average ancestors lived on. And people in relatively high-income countries like the United States live on anywhere from 20 to 30 to even up to 100, perhaps, times as much as our ancient ancestors did. Where historically speaking, life again was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, it is today the opposite of all of these things. It's connected. You can, with a supercomputer you keep in your pocket, carry on a conversation with just about anybody in the world in real time. Life used to be poor. Life today? No. Life today is very, very rich. You have Whataburger and Walmart, and you have more than one change of clothes. Okay. Deciding what to wear is a luxury of the modern world. Life used to be nasty. No, today life is clean. If you've bathed today, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on who's bathed today, you have, once again, enjoyed a privilege that most of our ancestors couldn't have. If you've ever seen Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail, there's a scene in which King Arthur is going through town, and someone says, "Oh, that's got to be the king." And someone says, "Well, how do you know he's the king?" And the guy who identified him as the king said, "Well, he's the only one who doesn't have fecal matter all over him." Used a 4-letter S word that is a synonym for fecal matter that I can't say on camera or in polite society. But yeah, you're pretty much mucking around in filth for most of history. Today, again, you get to wear clean clothes, you get to bathe. Life is not nasty. Life is clean. Life used to be brutish. One of the most unfortunately human things that we do to each other is treat one another as less than human. We do horrible, horrible, horrible things to one another, but not at nearly the rate that our ancestors did. Our ancestors living nomadic lives, our ancestors living in the caves, our ancestors living even a few hundred years ago, were much more likely to die at the hands of another person than we are today. Life used to be brutish. Today, life is much, much, much more peaceful for the average person than it's ever been. And again, according to Hobbes in The State of Nature, life is short. What we've seen is that in the modern world, life is pretty much the opposite of this. You live a life today that is connected. You live a life that is rich. You live a life that is clean. You live a life that's relatively peaceful. And you live a life that's extremely long. The modern world today is very, very different from the world our ancestors inhabited. And the best illustration of that, I would submit, is a trip to Walmart or a trip to Target, or if you're feeling really fancy, a trip to Costco. This, I would argue, is the greatest story never told. The greatest story never told. Things are so great, and things are getting so much better, that not only is extreme poverty, as defined by various international agencies, falling as a fraction of the human experience, the raw number of people in the world living in extreme poverty is falling and has fallen. Again, you look at most of history, go back to the early 1800s, there's about 1 billion people in the world, and almost every single one of them lives on roughly the equivalent of about $2 a day. So almost everybody lived in what we would today call extreme poverty. The world's population rises and rises and rises and rises and rises. Right around here, right around the late 1970s, early 1980s. I was born in 1979. Right around this time is the time that China actually starts to liberalize and adopt what McCloskey and I call the bourgeois deal, at least to a certain extent. From this point forward, the absolute number of people living in extreme poverty begins to fall, such that today it's maybe around 500 million people. Now, any decent person, of course, is going to say 500 million people living in extreme poverty is 500 million people too many, but it is much, much, much better to have 500 million people out of 8 billion living in extreme poverty than to have almost 2 billion out of about 4 billion people living in extreme poverty, which is what we had a mere 3 or 4 decades ago. It wasn't because of a bunch of things. It wasn't because of a sort of usual set of suspects. The world didn't enrich itself because of saving as such, even though, and I'm going to sound like your parents for just a second, you should save. You should save more. You should start now. It's wise for you. Indeed, write this down. If, beginning from the time you get your first job, you put 15% of your income in an S&P 500 index fund every year, you will never have to worry about money, and you'll probably retire a multimillionaire. Okay. Problem solved. But saving per se didn't really contribute that much to what we call the Great Enrichment. Maybe a few percentage points. And a few percentage points is great, but if we're talking about a 1,500 percentage point or a 1,600 percentage point increase in standards of living, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 20, even 100 percentage points is really not that much. Okay. So we didn't get rich because we started saving more. We didn't get rich because of science as such, though once again, science is great, and science is awesome, and science is absolutely fantastic, and we should do more of it, and maybe this relationship has changed in the last few decades. But science, as great as it is, does not explain the Great Enrichment. The history of science and technology is by and large people finding something that works and then only later figuring out the underlying scientific principles. Okay. There are some important scientific innovations that help to contribute to the Great Enrichment, but by and large, most of what was called the wave of gadgets that swept across England during the Industrial Revolution was not stuff that we did some abstract science and figured it out. We invented something in somebody's garage or somebody's workshop and then only later figured out how it worked. Okay. Now then, how many of you have ever been to a bar? All right, it's a decent number of people have ever been to a bar. How many people have ordered a mixed drink in a bar? All right. How many people ordered a mixed drink from someone who is a chemist? Okay. Do you need to understand basic chemistry to be a good bartender? No. No, you don't. How many people have ever been to an Astros game? Okay. All right. How many people have ever done vector calculus while a pitch is going across the plate and while someone's cranking it into the left field stands? Who's the Astros' best player these days? I don't really keep up with baseball as much as I should.
Altuve still.
Who?
Altuve still.
Altuve, okay. All right, so while he's in the batter's box, is he doing advanced vector calculus, trying to figure out when to swing the bat, how hard to swing, where to swing, et cetera? No, he's not. No, he's not. Now, the underlying physics behind all that stuff is really, 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 really cool. Really cool. But you don't need to understand physics in order to be a good batter, or in order to be a good pitcher, or in order to be a good soccer player. David Beckham can bend it like Beckham, again, without understanding the underlying physics. It wasn't, we would argue, because of science, even though we would agree that we should probably have more of it. It wasn't because of stadiums and big public works. It wasn't because of stadiums and big public works. It wasn't because of Energy Stadium. It wasn't because of Minute Maid Park. It wasn't because of the new progressive stadium that we just built in Birmingham. Okay. Generally, it's not because of big monuments and big government spending programs. Okay. If anything, the effect of these big spending programs is somewhere between neutral and negative. Now let's get to the bad stuff. There's a lot of good things that don't explain the Great Enrichment. The bad things themselves don't explain the Great Enrichment either, specifically slavery, imperialism, colonialism. Greta Thunberg could not be more wrong about the sources of modern prosperity. Slavery made some specific people very, very rich. Imperialism made some specific people very, very rich. Colonialism made some specific people very, very rich. Okay. If you look at history, the largest concentration of millionaires anywhere in the world in the antebellum period was concentrated in Mississippi. Mississippi plantation owners. If you've ever heard of Cecil Rhodes, if you've ever heard of the Rhodes Scholarship, he was one of many imperial adventurers who was made very, 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 very wealthy by imperialism in Africa. If you've ever heard of King Leopold of Belgium and what he did in the Belgian Congo, which is one of the greatest horrors ever visited upon humanity by anybody, he was made very, very rich by imperialism, by colonialism. However, just because something makes one or two or three or even a few thousand specific people very, very wealthy does not mean that it's sufficient to enrich entire societies. We're not trying to figure out why slave owners and the descendants of slave owners are wealthy. We're not trying to figure out why the descendants of Cecil Rhodes are wealthy. We're trying to figure out why the average person, the descendant of the average peasant of England, Belgium, pretty much any modern African country nowadays, has a standard of living much, 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 much higher. Slavery, imperialism, colonialism were net drags on economic prosperity. Again, they might have made some specific people very rich, but they did not, in fact, enrich entire societies. In the case of slavery, there's some very interesting new research by a couple of economists named Richard Hornbeck and Trevon Logan, arguing that the economic gains from emancipation in the United States were, at a very, very low end, about 3% of US income, and at a high end, 30 or 35% of US income. Another way to think about that, they argue, is to think about the economic gains from emancipation in 1865 being roughly the equivalent of having 60 years of technological progress happening more or less all at once. Okay. Slavery was an economic drag on the world. Imperialism and colonialism were economic drags on the world. And we've known this for quite some time. Some economists, the economist Lance Davis has actually estimated that the rate of return, if you calculated the return on investment in the British Empire, it was negative. Okay. Return on investment in the British Empire was negative. It made some people very, very rich, but it didn't enrich the average Briton, and that's what we're trying to explain. What was it because of? It was because of new ideas. It was because of new ideas. New ideas for things like steam engines, which I'm sure you well know about. New ideas for things like factories, things like eventually power plants, things like toothpaste, things like toothbrushes, electric toothbrushes are a truly incredible and amazing thing. Things like the light bulb. If you look around at all of the cool stuff that you have these days, new ideas for water bottles, new ideas for mobile communications, new ideas for ways to keep water cold and coffee warm. This explosion of new ideas, we argue, is what explains the Great Enrichment. And this explosion of new ideas came from a couple of forces. One, liberty. Liberty. The right to try something new without having to ask anybody's permission. I mentioned Walmart a moment ago. I've done a lot of research on Walmart, and Walmart illustrates this very nicely. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Sam Walton ran a bunch of discount stores, or a bunch of like 5 and dimes in Arkansas, and he got this idea. He said, you know what, I think if you were to put a big discount retailer in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas, it could do very, very, very good business, and it could make a lot of money because people might drive from all around to go to this gigantic discount store. He didn't have to ask permission from anybody to try this out. He simply had to persuade a couple of people to lend him some money, his father-in-law, for example, and have a go at it. He didn't have to ask permission from the government. There's no Bureau of Retail deciding, well, do we really need this kind of store or that kind of store or the other kind of store? Nope. Nope. He could have a go at it. It was because of dignity. It was because of dignity. Indeed, today we venerate people like Sam Walton who tried something new and who made enormous amounts of money doing it, and in the process, helped to greatly enrich the world. It was by no means certain, again, in the case of Walmart. Sam Walton, when he was trying to hire people, he'd make an offer to somebody who worked for like a chain of drugstores or whatever in Texas, and the person would go back to their boss and say, well, you know, this Walton guy has offered me a job working for his company. Can you match the offer? And the person they'd be talking to would say, well, fine, if you want to ruin your life, go with this Walton guy. He's crazy. He's absolutely crazy. Well, one, he had the liberty to try. Two, we live in a world that offers at least a certain amount of social dignity to buying low, selling high, being a good accountant, being a good stockbroker, simply being good at your job and doing stuff like showing up on time, and boom, we got the Great Enrichment. It hasn't always been this way. For most of history, somebody who would be what we would call today a disruptor might end up being thrown off a cliff, or might end up being executed, or might end up being somehow squashed as a threat to the social order and as a threat perhaps to the elites. Today, we put those people on the cover of magazines like Forbes and Fortune and say, we want to be like them. Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, recently said, if you want to help the world the most, if you want to do the most for the world's poor, bust your butt and get rich. Bust your butt and get rich. The fact that he can say something about something like that today is part of a change in ideas about liberty, changes in ideas about dignity, and changes in the way that we talk about these kinds of things. Now we got to wonder, why are the people at Costco and Walmart and Target and other places there for me? And they are. It's because they care about me. I bought this belt at a Walmart in somewhere in central Alabama. Did the people at Walmart, did they wake up and say, you know what, there's an absent-minded economist who's going to be in town to talk to a bunch of high school kids about personal finance, and he's going to tell them to invest their money in index funds, and true enough, he's going to leave his belt at home. We need to get up early, and we need to be there for him. We need to make sure we got plenty of belts at a reasonable price. No. That is so totally not what happened. One of the beautiful things about this modern world of liberty and dignity and free markets and stuff like that is that, quite frequently, the best way to take care of ourselves and the people who matter to us is to work hard to take care of strangers and the people that matter to them. The way Adam Smith put it is, and I quote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." We created a world in which the best way to serve yourself and the best way to serve the people who matter the most to you, the best way for me, for example, to take care of my own kids, to take care of my nieces that I'm going to be hanging out with for the next couple of days, is to do things that make other people's lives better, and vice versa. We live in a world that has embraced exchange, that has embraced innovation, and that has decided, really, there's really not that much wrong with all this. So what do we do about it? What do we do about going forward? There are two ways to split this. One is to ask, what do we do as a society? And then the second thing we would ask, I would argue, would be, what can I do? What should I do as an individual? Private policy, one, I would argue, simply mind your own business. And notice that business is in italics and underlined here. Mind your own business, buying low, selling high, managing your money, taking care of your family, taking care of your church, taking care of the things that you can have the biggest effect on. Things you can have the biggest effect on. Recognize to a great degree that if you're not stealing, which is wrong, if you're not defrauding people, which is wrong, by and large, you are making money if you are making other people's lives better. Okay. Mind your own business. Okay. Mind your own business. From a matter of public policy, we should embrace an ethos of what the scholar Adam Thierer calls permissionless innovation. Permissionless innovation. I mentioned a moment ago that Sam Walton didn't have to ask anybody's permission to start Walmart. The folks who started Target didn't have to ask anybody's permission to start Target. Saul Price, who started a store called FedMart, that eventually, a few decades later, would give rise to this place called Costco. He didn't have to ask anybody's permission to try something new. We're going back on that just a little bit today. A lot of people actually have to ask permission to start a business. They have to ask permission to apply a particular trade. They have to get licenses. They have to jump through all sorts of different hoops and things like that. If, once again, we want to take a world where there are still 500 million people in extreme poverty, if we want to lift them out of that extreme poverty and bring them into this great enrichment that we all enjoy today, as a matter of private policy, I would argue, we would do well to mind our own business. As a matter of public policy, we would do well to embrace an ethos of permissionless innovation, to embrace an ethos of effectively unrestricted immigration too, but that's, we can talk about that during the Q&A. Unrestricted innovation, in short, to coin a phrase, to leave people alone and let them make us and the 500 million people still living in extreme poverty rich. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have. I'll look to the faculty to kind of keep us on time here. I know some people have got to go to class in a bit. I've got 1:11, so plenty of time for Q&A. What can I tell you? Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So the question is whether or not this explains the divergence between Northern Europe and Southern Europe initially. So one of the things that we discussed it in the book, I kind of skipped over it in the presentation, is that there's this big, weird historical question, which is why of all places did the Great Enrichment begin in northwestern Europe? If you went back 1,000 years ago, and someone said, there's going to be a great enrichment, where's it going to happen? The smart money would have been on China. It was by virtually every measure, culturally, technologically, et cetera, it was the most advanced place on earth. Okay. If you wanted to bet on a dark horse, you would have bet on the Islamic civilization of the Middle East. Science, poetry, philosophy, all of that, again, relatively advanced. Northwest Europe was just this sort of bizarre backwater, people slaughtering each other, painting themselves blue and worshiping trees. Okay. England, the British Isles, et cetera, 1,000 years ago, it was a weird place. But a few hundred years after that, as a result of a bunch of things that happened, so like, for example, the Dutch revolt against Spain, the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, all this sort of stuff happens, and almost sort of by accident, northwestern Europe becomes a place where not people become more moral, necessarily, but where people come to embrace relatively mundane bourgeois business activities like buying low, selling high, lending, things like that. Got started in northwestern Europe, then it spread around the world. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What worries you?
What worries me?
Yeah, nowadays, being about, for me, I think about the war in Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
or in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
What types of things worry you?
That's a very good question. What types of things worry me? So I'm generally pretty optimistic about the future. Even when you think about things like war in Ukraine, or things like war in Israel, or any of the sort of practically endless list of horrible things that happen in the world, historically speaking, it's smaller as a fraction of the overall human experience. So just to use an example, how many of you have ever seen a Florida Man meme? Florida Man. Florida Man does a lot of crazy stuff. Now, the simple fact of the matter is there are enough men in Florida that even if only like 0.1% of them were crazy people doing stuff like throwing alligators in windows at Wendy's, you'd still have Florida Man stories, like 4 or 5 Florida Man stories every day from here to eternity. So stuff like that's very, very vivid, but it may not necessarily be that frequent. Stuff that does worry me, just a little bit, largely just because it's the thing that's kind of on everybody's mind right now, is possible backlash against and dismissal of the institutions of sort of Western liberal bourgeois society, and the extent to which anti-Semitism appears to be making a comeback. That worries me. I don't know that it's sort of as big a threat to our future as it might at first appear, but that's something that does cause me to lose a little bit of sleep. Extreme environmentalism, frankly, as represented by Greta Thunberg and others, this worries me just a little bit. I think the environment's important. I like the environment. We shouldn't pollute, but at its more radical edge, people would look at the slide I showed a minute ago, saying that, hey, that there's now 8 billion people in the world. They'd see that as a tragedy rather than something to celebrate. And that concerns me. It concerns me and it bothers me, and I think it's wrong. Someone asked, I think it was Jane Goodall, the famous anthropologist, said, if you could change one thing in the world, what would you do? And she said, if I could do this without causing any additional suffering, I would wave a wand and cut the world's population in half, which I think is remarkable. She didn't say double the world's resources. She didn't say increase the pace of technological change. She said get rid of 4 billion people. That bugs me. Yeah.
I've got kind of 2 questions. One of them. So you say it's not because of science.
Right.
It's ideas, and then your examples are the light bulb, the electric toothbrush. I just want to challenge you a bit. I mean, it's one thing just to have great ideas, but underlying science, innovation, and technology behind it is there. How can you disregard science and technology?
Okay. So first, science matters. So what we're doing. So the question is about the importance of science. So one, we're not disregarding science. We're just saying it doesn't have as much explanatory power as a lot of people might think. Second, there's a difference between science and technology, where again, most of the history of technology has been figuring out how to do a particular thing, and then only later figuring out how the underlying science works. So to use just a couple of examples, people have been baking bread for a lot longer than we've known how the chemistry of bread baking works. People were making loans and doing pretty sophisticated financial stuff a long time before we figured out the theory of finance. So science is cool, and science is great. Science, I would argue, is something we should have more of, but I think that it is not science per se, but ideas about the dignity of innovators, the dignity of business people, and liberty for people to innovate and do business that is the real motor of the whole thing. Okay. So should we have more science? Absolutely. Okay. Does science explain the Great Enrichment? Not that much. Yeah.
Looking at your graphs and listening to you remind me a lot of Alex Epstein's Fossil Future,
Yeah.
where he really points to the technology of oil, and the graph even showed where the technology really brought us cheap
Yeah.
oil, that poverty went way down. Was there a certain innovation that inspired you to look at this whole process? What were your big ideas that you liked?
So, okay, yeah, so the question is about comparing this to Alex Epstein's work on fossil futures. So has Epstein spoken here?
No.
Okay, so there's someone to add to your list of people to bring. He's got two really interesting books. One is called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and then another is called Fossil Future. In terms of particular innovations that kind of inspired me to do all this work, I don't really know there's anything in particular. I keep coming back to the iPad, though. When it was first unveiled in 2010. I'd been out of grad school for a couple of years by this point, but I remember when Steve Jobs unveils the iPad, a lot of people saying, first of all, they laughed at the name because it sounds stupid. iPad. Okay, great. We're not 12 years old anymore. Let's move on. But then a lot of people said, well, what's it for? What's it for? Okay, well, and Steve Jobs himself maybe didn't know, but now we bloody well know what iPads are for. They are almost revolutionary innovations that make it possible, again, for people to do things that our ancestors couldn't have dreamt of. See other particular innovations, and in part, I would argue, and this actually gets to the science question just a little bit as well, changes in the history of retail in the last roughly 100 years, and in particular in about the last 65 or 70. So what made Walmart revolutionary was not invention of new technology as such and not new underlying scientific principles. What Sam Walton did, his major innovation, was first of all kind of a bet on what would sell where. And then second, taking technology that we'd had for years, trucks, warehouses, and conveyor belts, and rearranging them just a little bit in order to massively and rapidly increase the efficiency with which we can move goods from one place to another. So those are a couple of things that I would say still kind of inspire me.
We've got time for one more question, Art.
Okay, one more question?
Yep, go ahead.
Yep.
How would you suggest a college student go about embracing your philosophy of permissionless innovation?
College student embracing permissionless innovation. One, say no when everyone says you should have to have a license for that. Just to use one sort of very specific example, my former hairstylist. So like at one point, like this is one of the things that, I've been married for 20 years, and gentlemen, like when you get married, eventually you embrace, like your wife gets you to the point where you're like, okay, fine, I'll have a hairstylist rather than just someone who cuts my hair. He used to be a prison guard. But one day I showed up, sat down in his chair. I'd been sick, so I kind of looked like Grizzly Adams, and was thinking, I hadn't shaved in a few days, and I remembered watching old episodes of Andy Griffith with my dad. We got Floyd the barber sitting in the chair Floyd the barber shaving people as they're sitting in the chair. I said, well, how much would it cost for a shave? And he said, well, I can't do that. I can't do that, because to do that, you have to have a barbering license. I've only got a cosmetology license. So he could use a straight razor to scrape the back of my neck, but it would have been against the law for him to use that straight razor to scrape my cheeks or the front of my neck. That strikes me as absurd. So embracing permissionless innovation would be, one, just from a policy perspective, trying to push back against rules and regulations, and in particular licensing restrictions. Second, just cheering people on as they have a go, encouraging people to try new things. Okay. That's not really a policy thing, that's more of a cultural issue, but recognize that someone who decides that they want to try to start a new fast food franchise to compete with Whataburger is frankly probably doing more good for the world than someone running for public office or someone becoming a regulator, or even for that matter, somebody perhaps even going into charitable work. So I know that was the last question. Happy to stick around and continue the conversation. Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it. Had a wonderful time.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.